First and foremost, I want to apologize a little bit. My voice is a little ragged right now. I just got back from Anchors Away Anaheim, which was a phenomenal time. Everybody enjoyed it. Everybody had a great time. USS Iowa was great. No better ship to be on for Veterans Day. But, moving on. Many of you know that I'm a veteran. I'm coming up on 17 years in the Army Reserves. I follow my father, a West Point graduate of the class of 1967, who flew UH-1s in Vietnam, and my grandfather, who fought in Patton's Third Army during World War II. This Veterans Day I pay tribute to the service of all veterans, and will tell one of the many stories my grandfather left with us before he passed away. Each story he had is unique, but this one is quite special. And I know this is not Navy, but it's World War II, and equally enjoyable to hear. The war was not easy on my granddad, or Opa as I called him growing up. He was a forward observer, calling in artillery under intense and dangerous conditions. Due to this, he was also in situations where he had to fight close quarters as infantry. This story, however, will focus on an incident that occurred after the war. It takes place shortly and after the dinner party immortalized at the end of the movie Patton, of which Opa attended in real life, guarding the whiskey. Even after the war was over, Opa was in a situation where he was almost killed, due to a mission he was sent on. His death would have been directly attributed to a crisis that was so big. President Truman himself made the final decision. It was this decision that would directly impact First Lieutenant Matthews' fate. Colonel Epps, a fellow Portsmouth, Virginia native, called Opa into his office at midnight and gave him a map to get to Vienna, Austria, and passes to get through the American and Russian lines. He told him to go to Vienna and pick up Russian Field Marshal Timochenko at 6 a.m. and to escort him back to Linz to meet with General Walker. He was then to wait for the meeting to end and escort the Field Marshal back to Vienna and then return to Linz. In a jeep by himself, Opa set off to Vienna and met the Field Marshal and his entourage. He started the return trip in front of a small convoy that consisted of his jeep and 4 to 5 civilian cars full of the Field Marshal's aides, translators, and of course, the Field Marshal himself. The trip was about 100 miles, but it took 5 hours to travel. The reason for this was the number of times they had to stop and show passes to cross lines, the poor condition of the roads, and most frustrating of all the flat tires. The tires on the civilian cars were of very poor quality and they were constantly going flat. When they finally arrived in Linz, Opa waited outside the meeting place while General Walker and Field Marshal Timochenko talked. Opa spent the time talking to one of the Russian translators. He learned that the meeting was called because the Field Marshal wanted the Allies to split some of the captured German war treasures with the Russians. It seems that when the war ended, there were hundreds of German boats along the banks of the Danube River. The boats were full of treasures, and the Russians were demanding the Allies give the Russians every other boat. General Walker said that this was too big of a decision for him to make, so he sent the request up to General Patton. Patton said it was too big for him to make, and he bumped the decision up to General Eisenhower, who said, you guessed it, it was too big for him. The decision finally went to President Truman, who had no problem with all making the decision. He said, hell no, and that was that. Timochenko was furious and left the meeting madder than hell. As a consolation prize, he was given new tires for all the cars in his convoy, plus some spares. On the return trip, Opa led off in his jeep, with the 4 to 5 civilian cars with the aides, translators, and one very angry Field Marshal. They stopped several times for the still occasional flat tires. Shortly after crossing the Russian lines, but still shy of Vienna, the Field Marshal's car had a flat tire. While the tire was being changed, the translator Opa had chatted with came up and talked to him. He told him that Timochenko was both furious and scared. It seems that he was afraid of being shot by Stalin when Stalin found out the Allies had refused to split the war booty. He was also furious at the Americans for putting him in the position, and Opa was the only American around that he could take his frustrations out on. And, to add to the precarious situation, they were currently behind Russian lines. The translator suggested that Opa discreetly get out and return to the American lines while he could. If they reached Vienna, it was highly possible the Field Marshal would take his wrath out on Opa and have him shot, never to be heard from again. Opa had no way of getting out if they reached Vienna. So, while they were changing the tire, he did just that and quickly vanished back to the American lines. When Colonel Epps asked Opa how things went, Opa curtly replied, "Mission accomplished," and left it at that. However, it bothered him for quite a while that he didn't really complete the mission, and he was worried that he would get in trouble. It wasn't until several years after the war, when Colonel Epps stopped by my grandfather's restaurant, The Circle, that he confessed that he had not quite completed the mission. Colonel Epps said that Opa had done exactly as he would have. Colonel Epps was the liaison officer for the 65th Division, and his office's job was to monitor radio traffic. At night, someone had to stay up and keep an eye on the transmissions in case something important came up, even though the war was over. During the months of June and July, Opa had the duty of monitoring the late-night radio traffic. Every other night he would do this duty, and then when he got off, go have breakfast. At this time in the morning, there were usually a few men eating. One of the regulars who ate alone was a Russian colonel who wore a patch over one eye and had about 25 medals on his chest. One morning the colonel asked Opa to join him. After several breakfasts together, Opa had gleaned what the war had been like from the Russian point of view, and heard what the Battle of Leningrad had been like from one who had been there. The Russian asked Opa what he'd be doing next. Opa didn't know. He wasn't sure if he'd accumulated enough points to be rotated back to the States. He was worried that he may have to go to the Pacific and fight the Japanese. The Russian said that Opa would not be going to the Pacific. The war with the Japanese would be over in a month. He told Opa that the Americans had a big bomb to drop over Japan, and that it would destroy an entire city. The war would be over in a month. Opa thought this guy was nuts, that there was no way a single bomb could destroy an entire city. Well, the Russian colonel was right, although his timing was a little off. Opa was one of the few men in the entire world to know about the atomic bomb before it was dropped on Hiroshima, even if he didn't believe a single word of it. Opa was overseas for less than 18 months, but that short time was a pivotal time in his life. Like hundreds of thousands of American men, he had not questioned anyone as to why he'd been drafted and taken away from the good life. He didn't complain that he had to go into the army and fight. For Opa, the war years were both fun and as frightening as anything seen by man. For years after the war, my grandfather would have nightmares about the things he had witnessed. The death, the destruction, the loss of so many friends, and the gruesome liberation of a concentration camp marked him. Years later, when given the opportunity to visit his son, my father, in Germany, he could not will himself to go, as much as he wanted to see him and his newly born grandson who's telling you this story right now. It brought back too many painful memories. Happy Veterans Day, and to all those in the other countries celebrating Armistice Day and Remembrance Day, I honor your fallen. Have a wonderful week. Zoop out.